McCullough. The most painful era in our nation's history was the Great Depression of the 1930s. In Kentucky, coal miners and their families were living on weeds. As a small boy in Pittsburgh, I saw tramps begging at the back door for food. When a single automobile plant closed in Detroit, 75,000 men lost their jobs. There were no unemployment benefits to fall back on then, no Social Security. If you were out of work, that was it. And at one point, there were 13 million out of work. Herbert Hoover got the blame, but no one person caused it, and there were no easy answers. Some men claimed to have them, however, and desperate times and desperate people gave rise to a string of homegrown demagogues. A demagogue is somebody who gets power by playing on emotions and prejudices. Tonight's film, The Radio Priest, is about one such figure, Father Charles Coughlin.
New York City, May 22nd, 1935, in the 6th year of the Great Depression. It was a moment in the American experience of national confusion and soul-searching, a time for visionaries and for demagogues, a time when the crowd was drawn to Madison Square Garden not by a concert or sporting event, not by a president, but by a priest.
Turns out 18,000 strong for a glimpse of Detroit's famous radio orator, Father Charles E. Coughlin. Regardless of whether they agree with it or not, they're here to see one of the outstanding figures in the public spotlight today.
The banker is demanding that he retain his customary standard of living while he forces the laboring men of America by his cruel exploitation onto a wage level and a standard level that is just this side of the Bolshevik.
Father Coughlin called on Americans to take a stand for God and for country.
I ask you in the name of Christianity, which abhors communism, in the name of patriotism, which loved America to carry it on to victory, I ask you if you will rise in your places and pledge with me to restore America to the Americans.
Few voices in that troubled decade would sound so promising to so many Americans, or so threatening. Americans had awakened early in this century to great expectations of their country and of themselves. If there was a vision of America, of the way life was supposed to be in the 1930s, it was this.
As the sun stretches fingers of light across the pavements, the early morning sparkles with the greeting of men to men. On their way to factories in Flint and Atlanta, from Tarrytown to Oakland, along the roads to the factories,
there's no consensus on what caused the Depression, only that it was a national crisis without precedent. Billions of dollars, thousands of businesses and farms, and a nation's sense of direction were lost. When asked if there'd ever been anything like the Depression, the economist John Maynard Keynes replied, yes, the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years.
times were so bad that they were like a catastrophe, like a typhoon or a hurricane or a tornado. Everybody was simply bewildered. And I think probably the bewilderment after a year or two, after about 1932 or 3, became, in many cases, a really dull, flaming anger. The world can't do this to me.
The world seemed out of control. What man hadn't wrought, nature had. Dust storms brought a blizzard of despair and discontent.
Our organization is the last hope of the American farmer for independence. It is fighting a battle that will determine the issue as to whether the farmer shall become a peasant, the menial slave of the users and the industrialists, or whether he will maintain the birthright he inherited from his father.
Inequities bred causes and confrontation.
We're going to bring our union into Monroe. And we're going to make men out of those hoodlums that say they'll drive us out and keep us out of the city of Monroe, Michigan.
In the turmoil and disorder, there was fear and reaction.
The National Guard has been ordered into active service by our governor for the purpose of maintaining law and order in San Francisco and protecting life and property. This we propose to do at any cost.
America wasn't at peace with itself, and many Americans were ready to believe without question the claims of confident voices like Father Coughlin's.
I know history. I know how to interpret events, at least in some small degree. And I know that it's better to stir up the people for the injustice that is perpetrated against them by industry and finance, rather than cast all the past upon the throw of the dice of fortune. Oh, I am not proud if I have prophesied that democracy is in danger and that dictatorship at least has cast its shadow upon our flag.
The priest was the person who came to your house for a sick call, and he's the person who consoled you in your grief and shared your joy of weddings and baptisms with you. But he wasn't on the radio talking to millions of people every day, blasting governments and ethnic groups and religions and making charges and making accusations. And I think he was an absolute departure from anything that we had seen in this country. A priest with the collar of the Roman Church on a platform screaming.
Oh, I wonder why the Baruchs, the Warburgs, the Morgans, and the Kempmen, all the nation is wise.
Bankers, for one, heard the raised voice of the radio priest. So did a restless audience with reason to distrust a system that for many of them had failed.
This is what I so often refer to as the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. This is the system of modern capitalism, which from governmental analysis proves beyond dispute or question that in it there is no just sharing of profits in this nation. Remember that you're an American first. Remember that you're only Democrats, or Republicans, or progressives, or partisans second.
By 1936, he commanded a following that couldn't be ignored, not by politicians, nor by the media.
As another presidential election approaches, a Roman Catholic priest, for the first time in American history, is seriously involved in national politics.
Some are unpopular, but God hates the hypocrite.
At his shrine of the Little Flower near Detroit converge elements of a mighty political power. A power that grows with every name added to the 12 million already in his letter files. with every handshake that adds another individual to his colossal following, which he has welded into the most potent political lobby this country has ever known, the single-voiced National Union for Social Justice.
It's easy to appeal to a mass audience, especially when you've got something to sell them. And he was selling them. He was selling hope. And he was selling a new deal for them without ever calling it that. You know, a distribution of the wealth, a fair shake for the people who don't have it, against these bloodsuckers, these communists. And God, we were afraid of the communists. We knew what they were. They were godless. And you tell somebody in that era, in those conditions, that somebody was godless, say nothing else about them. We knew what they were.
People were ripe for somebody with answers. And a lot of people tried to have answers, but his were persuasive at the time because he was looking for the causes of unemployment. He was looking for the causes of social injustice. He had demons and evildoers that he could point fingers at, and they got more and more specific as he went on, as you know, and became ultimately those international Jewish communist bankers.
Again, now we're going back into the Depression when people were really waiting for a messiah of some sort. And he had a lot of good thoughts. If you read any of his old things that he said, very much the champion of the underdog, very much.
I think you couldn't be neutral to Father Coughlin. I think you had to be with him or against him.
The gospel according to Charles Coughlin had its beginnings in Canada, where he was born, educated, and ordained. In the early 1920s, he crossed the border to Detroit, a parish priest who loved politics and Shakespeare. The Shrine of the Little Flower would be his stage, but he had to build it himself. Even then, he was thinking big. For a working-class suburb, which included only 25 Catholic families, he built a church to hold 600 people. He was 34 when his church doors opened in 1926, a time and place when a young priest had to fight his own battles. His first was with the Ku Klux Klan. If there are turning points in the lives of public figures, this was Father Coughlin's. The historic moment was recreated by the March of Time newsreel, using a stand-in for Coughlin himself, a sequence never shown in its entirety.
Bigot! 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 They want to fight. I'll give them one by radio. Sermons over the radio from my church. Somehow I'll get the money to do it.
It's as if he looked into the ashes and divined the future. The miracle of the age would be his salvation. All of America was turning to the radio. It was the start of a revolution in mass communication. The radio became America's most important piece of furniture. In the Depression as never before, bad news traveled fast.
Columbia calling Berlin. Columbia calling Berlin. Come in, Berlin.
Increasingly, what we heard defined the reality of our lives and the ways in which we sought comfort and escape.
Cato, it must be done. Mrs. Bennett is going to hear from the Green Hornet.
My time is your time. Your time is my time.
Once again, we bring you the romance of Helen Trent, who sets out to prove for herself that because a woman is 35 or more, romance in life need not be over.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?
Don't get scared and start turning off your radios, huh? I'm not advertising or trying to sell you anything.
By the early 30s, comedy and adventure had to compete with the drama of the radio priest. Coughlin made it to the top of the ratings and into the fan magazines.
I dim all the lights and I sink in my chair. The smoke from my cigarette climbs through the air. The walls of my room
about the promise of opportunity, of celebrity and riches. Other religious voices were bound to be heard.
Stop! You're drifting away from the faith of your fathers. You're drifting away from prayer, drifting away from the Bible reading, drifting away from the family altar, and only ruin.
When evangelist Amy McPherson came to save Broadway, it was hard to tell a sermon from an audition.
Give me a burden for souls, Lord. Give me a love for the lost.
Thanks, everyone!
Father Divine was on radio and on Broadway, cast by his followers in the role of God. It wasn't an old-fashioned religious war. The stakes became even greater than that, a ratings war.
The world's youngest evangelist and preacher.
How many want to give the devil a punch in the nose, a brother, and twist his tail?
Inevitably, station managers had to make decisions. In Philadelphia, CBS asked its listeners to choose between the popular New York Philharmonic and the Radio Priest. By 187,000 votes to 12,000, Sunday afternoon at 4 went to Coughlin.
I am in deadly earnest. In no way do I decide tonight or any other time to show a lily-livered flag before those who hold power. They may hold power over politicians, but they hold no power over the pulpit of a Catholic church that dares preach for the alleviation of misery, free from the sins of the past and free from the excesses of the future. God be with you. God be with all of us in this fight that shall last until death comes if necessary, rather than till surrender bids us put up a white flag. Good night and God bless you.
Dynamic. He had the most dynamic voice I think I've ever heard. The most powerful voice I've ever heard. I think he could wake up the dead. It was that powerful.
I think people stopped to listen to Coughlin and to exchange views about Coughlin. Isn't this a remarkable personality? He speaks of social justice. He's a great human being. And that was the impression in many quarters. People did stop on Sunday afternoon on WJR. He was the dominant factor.
People were always waiting for that day to come when they could sit down and listen to him, because he had such a soothing voice that you forgot you were poor, you forgot there was a depression, and you forgot that you had to stand in line to get your food.
It had a caressing quality, a persuasive quality, a fatherly, reassuring kind of quality. Just when people needed reassurance, there was something in that voice which said, I am the resurrection and the life. You know?
Something in that voice inspired faith. A radio poll named Coughlin the nation's most useful citizen of 1933. The fighting priest had become a beacon of trust, of leadership, even a movie.
This is the Fisher Building, Detroit, from whose tower, the home of radio station WJR, have emanated many of the broadcasts of the Reverend Charles E. Coughlin, the voice of thought and sympathy from the heart of Michigan's greatest city. As the clocks in Detroit chime for... and those throughout the rest of the country chime their corresponding hours, some 30 million listeners gather at their radios to hear the voice of the Reverend Charles E. Coughlin, the fighting priest, as he greets them with his cheery...
Good afternoon, my friends. During the course of this address, it will be my privilege to disclose information which seldom levels down through ordinary channels to the general public. It is my duty as your spokesman to present it to you in this emergency, to the end that it will guide you in your decisions and stimulate you in your actions.
He was on, what, 40, 50 stations. He was reaching millions of people. He couldn't have done that stumping. He couldn't have done that, in huge coliseums. He had access to the people. He had access to them in their kitchens, and that's where the little Motorola's were. They sat there and they listened.
I seem to remember somewhere that somebody estimated that at the height of his popularity, he was talking sometimes to an audience of 45 million, which is incredible in those days. That outdoes anything, I think, in contemporary television.
It was becoming a familiar story, twice on the cover of Newsweek. Coughlin had built his church. Now he was building a movement.
On Sundays, Father Coughlin would speak from the tower, and people from miles around would come and stand on the grounds of the church to listen to him talk. There were visitors, all religion. It didn't make no difference what religion they were, but they all enjoyed to hear him.
Oh yes, they came by the busloads and tours. It was like Disneyland in a way. That was the place to go. And somebody would touch him, or they'd shake his hand, and they could go back home and they could tell everybody, I shook his hand, I touched him. This is the impact he had. It was like touching the Pope.
The volume of mail was so large that they had to put a post office in Royal Oak, and that is how we got the Royal Oak Post Office.
And he didn't ask for much. He asked for a dollar bill in an envelope. You put your dollar bill in an envelope, and it came out ultimately at $20,000 a week or whatever he was collecting there.
I would, at the risk of what remains of my chances for eternal salvation, compare him with the televangelists of today, because he was a forerunner of all that.
In the worst of the Depression, Father Coughlin was spending thousands of dollars a week to broadcast over his own network. By radio and by mail, he'd assembled the biggest block in the history of Christianity. He'd done it without any clear political affiliation or program, his platform a political stew of contradictions. He was for and against the capitalist system, for and against Roosevelt and the New Deal, for and against the demands of labor. The radio priest could be many things to many people, and it paid off.
I don't think any of those old people then thought he was getting rich, but he was. He was getting a lot of money. He was getting 400,000 letters a week coming into his radio program, and and people stuffed money in it to help support it.
In money orders alone, he cashed $500,000 of the tiny Royal Oak Post Office in less than 2 years. Along with money, Coughlin was raising controversy. While advocating that silver replace the gold standard, he had a secretary invest in silver futures. While denouncing Wall Street, he kept his own account at Payne Weber.
He lived extremely well. They say he had a personal income and that he made some wise investments. How do you know where a person like Father Coughlin gets his money? I'm sure people donated a lot of money. I don't know where all that money went to.
In Depression America, money was the subject of the hour and a regular topic of the radio priest. He didn't make sense to everyone. He didn't have to.
I know that everyone in this audience is of one mind on this point, that we want more democracy in financial matters and less plutocracy in matters of exploitation. For at the bottom of this depression, it's a money question. At the bottom of poverty, of unemployment, of confiscation, it's a money question. In 1776, Washington and Jefferson and their compatriots had hurled at them lies and charges and the epithet of revolutionary. Their lands were overtaxed, their laborers and farmers had been exploited, their liberties had been denied, their right to free speech in a petition had been scoffed at. They were called revolutionary. So are you.
If he was campaigning for fame and power, he surely found one, and the other seemed within reach. Surrounded by the flag and loyal supporters, Coughlin suddenly appeared with all the trappings and gestures of a candidate for office. Style counted as much as substance. For Coughlin, what counted most was an agenda that challenged not just the politics of the Depression, but the patriotism of anyone who disagreed. Anyone.
There is written in the Constitution of the United States that Congress has the right to coin, issue, and regulate the value of money. That's good Americanism, and it's good enough for me. Every politician today in the Democratic or Republican ranks who sits upon one of the thrones of the mighty doesn't believe in that part of the Constitution. They don't want to believe in that part of the Constitution. They're not even Americans, these so-called Democrats and Republicans. They might say that's radical. But the real radical is the Simon Legree of high finance who turns his lash about your shoulders and exploits from your pocketbook its last penny.
The tone had become menacing, even to presidents.
Try to keep cool with Cal. We try to become hard-boiled with Harding. We try to stay out of war with Woodrow. And we try to write a new deal with Franklin Delano. We're through with the sham battle of politicians, and now we're on our own. Therefore, under your congressional district presidents, form your battalions, take up the shield of your defense, unsheathe the sword of your truth, and carry on in Illinois so that the communists, on the one hand, cannot scourge us, and that the modern capitalists, on the other, cannot plague us.
Now an imposing figure on the political horizon, his religious calling had given way to a secular crusade.
I hoped he had stayed to teaching the children religion. I hoped he didn't get too involved in controversies that got him rather an extreme position. I hoped that he wouldn't be tempted to call the president of our country by insulting names.
The one thing that was important to the people who were listening, especially the Catholics, was that he was a priest, and that he spoke with the church's authority. And if he wasn't speaking with the church's authority, why the hell were they letting him speak and say these things?
In fact, Father Coughlin's political career was ringing bells of alarm inside the Catholic Church.
In Boston, revered old Cardinal O'Connell contemptuously refers to the Coughlin speeches as hysterical addresses and demagogic stuff. New York's Cardinal Hayes says nothing, but his expert on canon law announces that Father Coughlin has no business in politics. But in the Roman Catholic Church, a priest is answerable only to his immediate superior, and Father Coughlin's superior is his staunchest ally, 68-year-old Bishop Gallagher.
Father Coughlin has preached no heresy. I shall not interfere.
There was danger. Father Coughlin was in a stronger position probably at that time than Martin Luther had been centuries earlier. If he had 30 million listeners, if he could probably change a national election, or have a good chance to, though his effort was futile, I think that the church felt it's dangerous for him to have that much backing.
The times were ripe for a demagogue, and Father Coughlin was one of several who played on the Depression. I suspect if we had a Depression again of anything like that magnitude, we would have demagogues to rise out of it, you know, like tadpoles out of a swamp.
As the march of time saw it, the swamp was filled with unlikely creatures seeking the political mainstream.
Barnstorming up and down the nation today are the self-anointed messiahs of several new political minorities, the so-called lunatic fringe of the U.S. electorate.
God, let me be a rabble-rouser. I see chaos approaching, and our people are hungry. Why shouldn't the cream of the population enjoy the cream of the nation's wealth? In communism.
Among them, a Protestant preacher and professional agitator, the Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith.
I get my inspiration from the sky.
However inspired, a coalition was born.
Side by side, for the first time, stand the leaders of the lunatic fringe. Gerald Smith still claiming the support of 10 million share-our wealthers. Dr. Townsend boasting of 5 million followers. Father Coughlin estimating his strength at 9 million voters.
An ally of the assassinated Huey Long, Smith stepped forward to give his blessing.
These great, phenomenal assemblies, whether they be headed by Dr. Francis E. Townsend, Gerald Smith, or Father Charles E. Coughlin, represent the unmistakable edict that is being issued to the corrupt, seething politicians of America that the baby-having, stump-grubbing, sod-busting, go-to-meeting, God-fearing American people are about to take over the United States government of America.
The parson from Louisiana could inflame the crowd. Dr. Townsend's old age pension plan could comfort the crowd, but its leader was the radio priest of Royal Oak.
Godspeed in your new office, Father Coughlin.
He stood now at the head of his own organization, the National Union for Social Justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, at last the common people have got together.
It wasn't a political party, but the instrument of his political ambitions, a bold attempt to become a power broker in the 1936 presidential election. He had a candidate, a North Dakota congressman named William Lemke. He had money. He had his own newspaper, Social Justice Weekly. He had a huge audience. What Coughlin didn't have were the votes.
Colorado shows Roosevelt 2,000, Landon 1,400. Connecticut.
Neither did Alf Landon, the Republican candidate. They heard the news of the biggest electoral landslide the country had known on the radio.
A news flash, ladies and gentlemen, Roosevelt is re-elected.
President Roosevelt's New Deal had both inspired and infuriated an anxious nation. Despite FDR's overwhelming victory, the anxieties wouldn't go away. As he sat down in 1937 to begin a second term, neither would his opponents. In Royal Oak, the radio priest prepared for a new season, on more stations than ever before. And more than ever before, he preached a politics of fear.
There is nothing standing between our children and their enslavement to the fanatical regime of the Soviet, except the cross of Christ and the principles of social justice.
Mr. Roosevelt is notorious for his unbounded friendship for the Bolsheviks of Soviet Russia and
always struck for you to take the offensive against the Bolsheviks in our midst, the pinks, the reds, the radicals. In our colleges and schools, in our pulpits and in our government, communism has taken hold today. Clean out the Augean stables of labor that have been dirtied and defiled by communist leadership. Clean them out.
It wasn't the first Red Scare in American politics, and it wouldn't be the last. In the 30s, political tremors were being felt along an ideological fault line that ran from extreme right to extreme left. One of Coughlin's earliest political sermons was Christ or communism. For some, the only thing to fear was a revolution, a view formally endorsed by a congressional committee.
Although I am no alarmist and do not anticipate any revolution in this country this year or next year from communist sources, I do believe that their seditious activities and those of all of our enemies from within are far more serious to the welfare of our people and the maintenance of our Republican form of government than all our possible enemies from without.
At a time when in the name of Americanism, Father Coughlin could fill the seats in Madison Square Garden, so could American communists, with the same appeal to national frustration and tradition.
Americans have always been among the most revolutionary peoples of the world. Americans will not shrink from a new revolution when they understand that only by this road can they once and for all break the corrupting power of Wall Street over our land. It is an unwilling testimony to the correctness of the Communist Party when we declare that the main issue is democracy or fascism in America.
Fascism was another great fear and attraction of the 1930s.
During this last week of March 1934, troops bearing a foreign uniform have been drilling in 19 American cities. This membership card of the Friends of the New Germany bears the shield of the United States, over which has been placed the Nazi emblem. Hitlerism has invaded America.
Camp Siegfried, not Germany, but Long Island, New York.
Which way is the United States going to go? Is it going to go communist or is it going to go fascist? It's got to go one or the other. You really felt a great pressure to choose up sides and take one side or the other. And a lot of people quite seriously thought, well, fascism is better than communism.
If not thunder on the extreme right, there was a rumbling, an incessant drumbeat. The German-American Bund marched into Madison Square Garden with his own version of Americanism, and with its own American heroes and villains.
Ladies and gentlemen, you all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. But no, my friends, the press, the radio, and the cinema are in the hand of the Jews, and like Father Coughlin.
And one of its heroes was the radio priest.
And like Father Coughlin,
there was a time of demagogues across the world and demagoguery. And it was a time when, you know, in Germany they needed a Hitler, and maybe Coughlin felt that they needed a Charlie Coughlin here.
Think of all the Italians who went around calling Cedu, you know. And think of all of those people who listened to the harangues of Hitler and Goebbels on the air, as we all listened to them. You know, they made my hair stand on end, but a lot of Germans were listening and cheering. Not all Germans by any means, but a lot of them. And in the same way, in this country, people were listening to the demagogues who made use of the Depression for disastrous ends.
It was one of the tragedies of the Depression. For some among the dispossessed, the solution wasn't what to do, but who to blame. By the late 30s, Coughlin knew who they were.
The system of international finance, which has crucified the world to the cross of depression, was evolved by Jews for holding the peoples of the world under control.
This official paper prints the names of the Jewish bankers who helped to finance the Russian Revolution.
I was shocked that the resources of this nation should be employed against the Hitler government on behalf of German Jews to settle an internal problem in Germany.
What though they accuse you of stirring up the multitude? What though they maintain that you consort with sinners, be they Nazi or anti-Semitic or whatnot?
If we must accept Jewish leadership, that leadership will be identified with Jesus Christ, whom the Jews represent.
Oh, the courageous Christians of America will not be intimidated by name-calling, such as anti-Semitic, or by threats of investigation, or by a prejudiced press.
Well, if I went into the whole anti-Semitic thing, I would take up a whole week, and I have my facts and figures, but I don't want to get into it. He was not anti-Semitic. He was anti-Jewish. He was anti-banker.
Well, he always told me he liked Jews, he didn't like kikes. And I think that's the same as saying of any derogatory thing about perhaps an Italian being called a dago or a wop. It's the same comparison. But he was always against the international Jew, the international banker.
The National Union for Social Justice was readily conceived and was also entertained in my mind as an essential to help save America for the Americans. At that date, ladies and gentlemen, you had challenged me by millions of your letters. On that date, I appeared before a microphone and I accepted your challenge to organize for the purpose of our driving the money changers.
Social justice, deliverance from bankers and money changers. It had sounded promising.
When he spoke about driving out the money lenders, he was primarily attaching it to Franklin Roosevelt, to the administration he hated. And a lot of people believed, oh, he didn't mean the Jews. This is what he means to improve conditions in this country.
I found out years later that the Jews were frightened by Coughlin, or they were frightened by the talk. I mean, what was going on in Europe, they knew. What was happening in Germany, they knew. And here's a man who was embracing Hitler, who was, and I don't know who said that there was an amazing similarity between the things Coughlin was saying and the things Hitler was saying at the same time. The same phrases, the same harangues.
While he said, I'm a friend of the Jews and I'm not an anti-Semite, on every page of Social Justice you found anti-Semitism. In his radio addresses you had to detect it much more than you did in Social Justice.
Social Justice, whose circulation reached as high as 1 million copies a week, did more than reprint Coughlin's sermons. It reprinted the Protocols of Zion, a faked document also used in Nazi Germany, claiming that Jews were plotting to take over the world. According to Social Justice, Jews had financed the Russian Revolution, and the fascist countries of Europe were simply one line of defense.
Having read once for my sins the whole file of social justice, it's full of vituperation against the Jews and the protocols of Zion, all of that old batch of lies came out.
The possibility became a reality.
This Los Angeles bookshop of the Silver Shirts, dispensing anti-Jewish propaganda, is one of many that have recently opened all over the country. Note the name, Aryan Bookstore, and nearby a newsboy shouts his wares. The Silver Legion Ranger, a propaganda newspaper.
Late paper. Just out, late paper. Silver Ranger, late paper. Free speech stopped by Jew riot.
The politics of bigotry could include anti-Catholicism, as in the Black Legion, which had a chapter in Royal Oak, Michigan, but a message still familiar to Coughlin supporters.
Mr. Lupp, I understand that the Black Legion stands for pro-Americanism. Is that a fact?
That's right.
I understand also it is opposed to Catholics, Jews, and Negroes. Is that a fact?
Not the individual, but the activities of any subversive foreign groups.
Well, are not Catholics, Jews, and Negroes Americans?
As individuals, yes, but as an organized group, no. They are known in this country as a foreign body. Defend the policy of myself and all loyal Americans to propound a pure doctrine of Americanism at all times. America for Americans.
America for Americans had become a warning, a battle cry for the Silver Shirts, for the Black Legion, and for Father Coughlin in the Christian Front.
I take my stand beside the Christian fronters. I understand that units of the Christian Front have formed and are forming in New York City and elsewhere. Does that mean anything to you Bolsheviks? It is time to eradicate them mentally, spiritually, and physically from our... Where do you stand? What do you plan to do?
The extremism rejected by most of his listeners was embraced by thousands of Coughlin's more fanatical followers. In the rhetoric of the radio priest, they heard a call to arms.
We will fight you in Franco's way if necessary. Call this inflammatory. It is inflammatory. Rest assured, we'll fight you and we'll win. Form your ranks in the church militant. This America is Christ's America.
The mix of religion and politics is always very volatile.
Father Coughlin in effigy. As his extremism increased, his audience declined, but never disappeared entirely. He remained a catalyst for strong emotions, still able to inspire the crowd to stand up. The Depression moved a great number of Americans to take a stand, to take to the streets. But back in the midst of the Depression, there was a moment in the American experience worth remembering. A summer afternoon in Cleveland, 1936, when, in a nation's desperation, so many seeking a leader found one in Charles Coughlin.
And to keep that ever-marching army of jobless upon our streets, wondering when God in his mercy would lift his hand.
It was a time when even in a democracy with traditions of liberty and tolerance, millions were ready to follow a persuasive voice, not always appealing to the best in us.
You appreciate the fact, my dear friends, that among other things in the National Union for Social Justice, we are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
Father Coughlin returned to his original calling.